I will just tell you that I have known Laurie for quite a long time. I'm just going to introduce her to you. For those of you who don't know, Laurie Carter Noble. She has been a member of First Church in Belmont before. She has been a lifelong Unitarian Universalist, and she has focused much of her life on doing research on Unitarian Universalist women, one of which is Olympia Brown. And hopefully we can get Laurie to come back and do a program on Olympia Brown. She has assisted and in the planning and editing of the anthology called Standing Before Us, Unitarian Universalist Women and Social Reform. And Laurie has also been a professor of English at Villanova University, Boston University, and she has taught in the lifelong learning program at Tufts University. And so we are so pleased and grateful to Laurie. We're pleased that she's back at First Church in Belmont now. And we're so pleased that she could be with us today to tell us a little bit about this incredibly interesting woman, Catharine Mariah Sedgwick. So I'm going to turn the program over to Laurie and put it in speaker view. And hopefully I'm going to make that happen so that all of you will see her. Thank you for being with us, Laurie.
It's just lovely being with all of you. Thank you so much for asking me to do this program, Lillian, and for all of your help with the photos and with so much else. Lillian is just has done such an extraordinary job to keep this community so vibrant and together in many ways during such a challenging year, and Ed for all of the you. A woman that I discovered because All Souls Unitarian Church in New York was celebrating their bicentennial 2 years ago. And All Souls has not had a single woman minister until 2 years ago when they have an associate now. So with the bicentennial, there was this rogues gallery of male ministers going back to 1840. And the committee thought, well, we can't just honor men at All Souls. And so they asked if I would find some women to honor in the congregation, which I was delighted to do until I realized I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't know a single, prominent woman in the congregation over the years. So they gave me some names, and I thought, okay, now what? Um, I took them to the research librarian at the library I belonged to in New York, and we decided on 3 women that we could find letters on, because letters really give you an insight into the character of the person. And that's what we did. And one of them is Catharine Mariah Sedgwick, who was one of the founding members of All Souls. And she was actually a Congregationalist because her family is a still very prominent family in Stockbridge. Their beautiful home is just a block down from the Red Lion Inn, where I usually stay in the summer. And after I delivered this lecture, I brought a copy to them at their homestead, and they asked me to tour the home, and it was just a lovely experience. So the library in Stockbridge is very proud of Catharine Mariah Sedgwick as well, has a whole room dedicated to her. And she was extremely prominent in the early 1800s, and I, an English major, had never heard of her, which is not good. But I hope that you get to know her and enjoy the experience as much as I have. Um, when Catharine Mariah Sedgwick was 10, she attended the local district school in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. As the daughter of the highly regarded Judge Theodore Sedgwick and the gentle and caring Pamela Dwight, Catharine made the most of her comfortable background, if not of her intellectual skills. Ambitious and conscientious in other ways, she was high-spirited and irrepressible, but found school routine extremely dreary. What did appeal to her, though, was being the star of her school firmament in ways other than academic. One of her biographers, Gladys Brooks, recounts one of Catherine's more memorable escapades during her early schooling. After school, every day, Catherine would show her leadership skills at an early age by arranging transportation for her schoolmates. This consisted of having Catherine's horse, Old Rover, delivered to the school so that she could take each schoolmate home on horseback. And Catherine was an excellent rider, and they tore through the landscape at a breakneck pace to the cheers of course, all of her schoolmates. She also, on Saturdays, was picked to help two girls who were assigned to clean up the schoolhouse for just the schoolroom for the coming week. And these two girls had the privilege of selecting a third girl to kind of be their assistant. And they had many girls to choose from. And you might have thought that they would have chosen Catherine for her congeniality and her wit and her just general charm. And no doubt that figured into the equation. But the other advantage she had was an unlimited credit account at the general store, thanks to her dad, the prominent judge. So when the two girls were sweeping up the floors, Catherine was going to the general store and acquiring a bottle of Madeira and sweets and raisins to take back to the other two girls, and they just had a wonderful time, thank you, on a Saturday afternoon. This just made the time pass ever so much more enjoyably until the day of reckoning came many months later, when the good judge received his semi-annual bill from the general store. Summoning his daughter up for a full reckoning on this very exorbitant bill, she described visiting with her dad and seeing his awful frown. In the judge's most somber terms, he told her, "My dear little girl, this must not be in the future." And so she tried to mend her ways, but she was a mischievous, iconoclastic woman to the end of her days. Born in Stockbridge, Massachusetts on a bitter cold night, December 28, 1789, Catherine was the sixth child in her family. She arrived 2 months early and was warmed into being in the capable and loving hands, she recalls in her letter, of the chief household retainer and ex-slave Elizabeth Freeman, affectionately called Mumbet by the family. Throughout the winter, with her mother too weak to nurse her, Catherine was given a bottle in the middle of every night by her devoted older sister Elizabeth. Through her family, and perhaps most of all, through the faithful and wise, compassionate and upright example of the primary caregiver of the family, Mumbet, Catherine would grow to become the mainstay of her family through some extraordinarily troubled times. Throughout her young life, Catherine's mother struggled with severe mental illness and often could not be cared for at home when her illness became too severe. During such periods in her life, a kindly doctor in a neighboring village would come and take Pamela Dwight Sedgwick and care for her in his own home. The challenges facing the many children of the Sedgwick family were made even more severe by the frequent absence of their father due to his legal and civic duties, which took him away from home many weeks at a time. As she was growing up and her sister married and her brothers were away at school, Catherine, with the extraordinary Mumbet, became the primary caregivers of her mother. In 1806, Pamela Dwight Sedgwick died. Catherine was 17 years old. Her father remarried 2 years later. However, in 1813, Judge Sedgwick died as well. I want to share with you how this admirable, if troubled family chose to be remembered. Lillian, if we could have the photo of the cemetery, that would be wonderful. 2 summers ago, I went to the cemetery because it's mentioned in Catherine Mariah Sedgwick's biography, and you can see it here. The two the two major headstones within the circle are of Theodore and Pamela Sedgwick. Catherine's stone is a cross with tendrils. I think it's the one to the left of to the right of the obelisk. It shows a cross with tendrils of ivy, and it's her Catherine's headstone is between her brother Charles and that of Elizabeth Freeman Mumbet, who is buried within the family circle in this lovely cemetery. The Sedgwicks have been, as I indicated, a prominent family in uh, in the Berkshires for generations, and one of their descendants, Kira Sedgwick, is a noted actress that you no doubt have seen in films. In 1821, Catherine Mariah Sedgwick, as well as two of her brothers, Robert and Henry, joined All Souls, the Unitarian Universalist Church. At that time, it was just Unitarian. I think that in 1821, she described the congregation as, and I think many of you who are UUs might understand this. Um, this congregation, says she in one of her letters, is comprised of strangers from inland and outland, English radicals and daughters of Erie, Germans and Hollanders, philosophic Gentiles and unbelieving Jews. In this our association, there is at least one of every sort, and that makes the congregation quite wonderful. In February of 1822, her brother Theodore encouraged Catherine to become a writer. Uh, he had praised her writing of letters and shorter pieces effusively, but she, as appreciative as she was of his kindness, was not at all as convinced of her talents as she was. And she says in one of her letters, "My brother makes extravagant estimates of my powers. It's one thing to write letters, and quite another to write a book." However, not wanting to disappoint her brother or seem ungrateful for his immense confidence in her, she proceeded to try to write a book. And thus Catherine Mariah Sedgwick, the novelist, was born. She chose to express her beliefs through her characters rather than moralizing or sermonizing to the reader. She would create for them specific situations in which the beliefs that she had that were part of the theme of her book would be expressed through the situations, the story, and the character, and not through the author pontificating to the reader. Her first novel is A New England Tale, and it was published in 1822. Happily, it found its way into the hands of a loving public who found her characters engaging and admirable, and her plot suspenseful. It's called A New England Tale and focuses on the plight of a virtuous orphan, Jane Elton, who chafes under the supervision of her grimly religious aunt, a strict Calvinist. Finally, however, Jane is rewarded for forbearance and filial duty to her aunt by finding a good man to marry her, who would offer her a life of security. Through the rigid and demanding aunt, Sedgwick satirizes what she finds the negative influence of Calvinism. And again, it's through the character and not through her own opinions relayed directly to the reader. As the omnipotent author, Sedgwick feels free to speculate um, more subtly about the blessings of a more liberal religion based on the belief that God is benevolent and human beings are perfectible, which is captured in the personality of the orphan Jane Elton, who has her just rewards by marrying a good man. It's interesting how many of Catherine Sedgwick's novels center on marriage and on all the benefits and felicities of marriage. She is known to have had many proposals, none of which she accepted, and lived a very fulfilled and happy life as a single woman until the day she died. However, she always promoted the concept of marriage, I suppose, in theory, if not in practice. As her fame as a novelist grew with the publications of her novels, Catharine Sedgwick felt it her duty to use her talents as a storyteller to illuminate ideas that would promote intellectual, social, and moral advancement. And if that doesn't sound like a Unitarian, I don't know what would. Intellectual, social, and moral advancement. I mean, that just could come right from William Ellery Channing. Through her stories, she championed such reforms as the alleviation of city tenement conditions, which in the early 1800s were perfectly dreadful, as you're all aware of, the abolition of dueling, which she found barbaric, and the propagation of religious tolerance, which she found essential. Catharine Sedgwick was also dedicated to prison reform and regularly visited the incarcerated at the Tombs, as well as Blackwell Prison and Randall Island. In addition, she was also dedicated to improving the conditions at the hospitals in the city of New York. According to her biographer, Gladys Brooks, Catherine Maria Sedgwick's genial and outgoing and personality, which was readily moved to compassion, caused many people suffering greatly to confide in her and to find her a comfort in their darkest moments. Catherine Sedgwick was also the president of the Women's Prisoners Association, and her work with the Prison Society, 3 days a week, mind you, occupied her into her very last years. In the course of her advocacy for prison reform, she befriended the formidable matron of Sing Sing Prison, whom Catherine Maria remembers as, quote, having the nerves to explore alone the 7 circles of Dante's hell. When urged by friends to decrease her charitable commitments, such as regularly visiting the schools of small Negro children in dire poverty in St. Giles District, she told people that she believed, quote, the little charity I do is conservative in its tendency. It takes me out of doors and is solacing to the heart after the heavy disappointments and amidst the wearing small trials of life. I feel the value of my work now more than ever I did, and take far more pains to nourish it than when I was younger and happier. In 1827, she wrote what many consider the finest novel about Puritan times published before Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. And Hawthorne, incidentally, had had very little sympathy with women writers, because many women writers wrote romances and potboilers and wrote novels that he didn't at all consider serious. But in Catherine Maria Sedgwick, he actually had someone to admire and indicated that she was the most truthful novelist in America, which for Hawthorne is high praise. The book in 1827 was titled Hope Leslie, and it's not focused on interactions between the colonists and the local Indians. Everil Fletcher and Faith Leslie, two of the colonists, are taken captive by a Pequod tribe led by the sachem Monomoto. When Fletcher is about to be killed by a tomahawk, the sachem's daughter rescues him. Furthermore, Faith Leslie, the other colonist, chooses to remain among the Indians, one of whom she marries. Considered one of Catharine's most fascinating books, it's also notable for the author's accurate portrayal of spirited and independent women who are the catalysts of much of the action. Startlingly, it is also a daring treatment of the subject of intermarriage between the settlers and the Indians. In her final novel, Married or Single, with a question mark, Catharine Sedgwick challenges the prevailing assumptions that women who are single are old maids and are to be pitied and regarded as dependent and not very useful. She also dispels the myth that single women owe their status to the fact that they must be undesirable commodities on the marriage market. The most powerful rebuttal of this myth of the useless old spinster and pathetic old maid is, of course, the way Catharine Sedgwick lived her own life. She was dedicated to caring for her mentally ill mother, ably supported by Mumbet. She was devoted to her many sisters and brothers. When they married, she found tremendous joy in being a companion, counselor, and confidant to her many nieces and nephews. They were the joy of her life. No doubt she was the joy of their lives as well. As the storyteller in her family, she proved especially popular with the younger children who always clamored for her tales at every opportunity, and she could no sooner come into a house than she would have to sit down with the younger children and immediately tell them a story. Coming from such a large family, Aunt Kitty, as she was called, took a lifelong delight in the nurturing and coddling, guiding and inspiring of the many young people that came to her, especially through her family. The gifts she gave to her family were amply rewarded by the love and encouragement and unfailing support which they gave to her. Whether exhorting her to have confidence enough in her skills as a storyteller to become a writer of novels, or to offer a home in New York City when she would come for long, regular visits, or making it clear in thought and gesture how much they valued her loving and warm personality, her family, and especially her brothers, were her biggest champions, and she of them. The affectionate letters that they exchanged, and these are especially wonderful in her collection, the letters are just extraordinary. The affectionate letters that they exchanged made it very clear that a house was not a home until it was enlivened by the resourcefulness, wit, and high spirits of their sister Catharine. Whether praising her storytelling or openly admiring her dedication to helping the poor of New York City or advocating for reforms in hospital care or prison conditions, they made their pride in Catharine Maria so very clear. In June of 1813, Catharine writes to her brother Robert, quote, "There is an activity in the principle of love that, like the impetuous element of fire, brightens and purifies everything it touches. I am satisfied by long and delightful experience that I can never love anybody better than my brothers. I have no expectation of ever finding their equal worth." Close quote, to which her brother Robert replies, quote, "Your letter has just reached me. I thank my soul for it. I can never be sufficiently grateful to my Maker for giving me such a sister. While we are on earth, let us vow never to waste a particle of that treasure we have in each other's affection." Close quote. Sadly, after her mother struggled for so many years with mental illness. She would later see her beloved brother Henry also succumb to severe mental illness later in life. It was he with whom she had joined All Souls and at whose house she had principally stayed so many times during her visits to New York City. Her biographer tells us that during the 1820s and 1830s, when the family would gather at the Stockbridge home and entertain friends, it would have been difficult to find a household with more good sense, more ease and freedom, or more gaiety and affection than the Sedgwick household. Catharine, with her light-hearted unconventionality, her sense of the ludicrous, and her intellectual keenness, was usually the central figure of any gathering there. And as I said, it's worth noting that Catharine writes glowingly of the joys and rewards of being married, although she chose to be a single woman all her life. By 1863, her health was declining markedly, and her family decided that their beloved Aunt Kitty should live with her sister Catharine in West Roxbury, outside of Boston, actually very close to the Channing Memorial Church in West Roxbury, the UU Church. Shortly after she arrived from her cherished Berkshires on April 1st, Catharine sadly was to suffer the first of her attacks of epilepsy. She accepted this with her usual good cheer and optimism and total lack of self-pity. To one of her nieces, she writes at this time, quote, "I don't lay out my future or count on it. I receive it gratefully day by day. I am treated here like a duchess by such friends and family as very few duchesses have." Close quote. As a final grace note, near the end of her life came a tribute from her friend William Cullen Bryant, the editor of the New York Post. While Catharine was staying with her niece, she loved to be on the plaza outside of the home and sit in the sun and read the New York Post, which she'd had a subscription to for years. But as her income dwindled, she felt that she should really give that subscription up and not use her remaining resources until she would have to be dependent on her family. William Cullen Bryant discovered the reason for her canceling the subscription and immediately reinstated it with a letter in gratitude for their friendship and as small recompense for the friendship of so splendid a woman. The life of the exceptional Catherine Maria Sedgwick came to a close on July 31st, 1867. In the glorious high summer, the Berkshire Mountains that she so loved were at their most splendid, and so she was laid to rest there. And in this place that she loved, she's forever encircled by the family she so loved, including the mainstay of the family, Elizabeth Freeman, known as Mumbet, once a slave. Catherine Maria Sedgwick was everything a woman could be and everything a woman should be. Thank you.
So, thank you so much, Laurie. And I wonder now if we open this up to questions, I'm going to put everybody in the gallery view so you can see each other and you can unmute yourselves, and I'll call on you for any questions that you might have of Laurie, and whether or not, I'm sure she'll be able to answer them, but I just wonder, does anybody have a question to start with? Because I do. I mean, I have a question for you, Laurie, that
Sure.
I just wonder what, I have not read any of her books and I don't know if anybody else has, but do you feel, I'm sure you have, and I wonder what you would say about the immediacy of her work today. In other words, is it is the quality of her writing? Would she speak to our audience? What 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 do you see as her lasting legacy for as a writer?
First of all, she is a very graceful writer. You know, she's not studiedly academic. I think because she was a natural writer, her writing is very spontaneous. I thought, by the way, her writing is, you can Google it. It's in the public domain. Her books will come up. And I read the Hope Leslie and the I read and her first novel, the A New England's Tale, and I just found the story engaging. And Catherine Sedgwick has a wonderful satiric perspective without any bitterness. She's just, for instance, in A New England's Tale, I know it's in Redwood. That was the other one I read. In Redwood, she's very satirizing of this socially prominent family that comes to, and they have an accident, and I think it was in Vermont, and so a farmer takes them in, and the man in the socially prominent couple is fine, and the woman just really feels that she's slumming with these, you know, rubes who are kind enough to take them in and have them overnight. And the way Catherine writes about the snobby woman is just so funny and so current. I mean, it just shows how graceful a writer she is, and how she speaks to through the generations. She's not at all, you know, sometimes in the mid 19th century, especially, you have the very moralizing writers or very serious, or they write such unbelievable stories it's, you know, it, they're kind of little antiquarian curiosities. But she just tells a wonderful story. I just love reading them, and I was, you know, I first read one kind of out of a sense of duty, thinking, oh boy, this is going to be a long day at the library, and it was such a surprise.
Jean, you have a question.
Yes, thank you so much for that, Laurie.
Thank you.
I'm curious to know who did she influence other writers coming along? I'm thinking of, you know, Louisa May Alcott. I mean, later on, I mean, in other words, so she was out writing, and she was writing as herself. She wasn't writing under, you know, a the term I want, you know,
Pseudonym.
yeah, pseudonym.
Right.
So I was curious whether or not there was any sense of that there are other women writers who see her as, you know, that influence them, or, you know, that the fact that she was out there writing and making a living, you know, as a writer, um, uh, again, maybe within the, you know, transcendental mode, or the, you know, New England, you know, area.
Especially since, you know, since Hawthorne took note of her. You know, that's such an interesting question. I'll have to research that. I don't, there's no evidence that I found that she had a relationship with Louisa May Alcott or vice versa, but that would make a lot of sense because Louisa May Alcott, as firm as she was about women, you know, paddling their own canoe and being self-sufficient, particularly with Bronson Alcott. Oh my, that's a whole nother story. Um, so she was, but Louisa May Alcott was not in the in a feminist the way we think of today. She wasn't at all interested in the suffrage movement, and Sedgwick was actually concerned about movements that became too militant. Abolition was one, as she was very, very firmly against slavery. She felt one of the most extreme aspects of the abolitionist movement made her very concerned because she felt that you win people over more with a conciliatory approach than a militant approach. And that's exactly how Alcott felt about the feminist movement, about the suffragists, exactly the same. And the fact that both of them used their writing to, you know, to supplement their income is also interesting, and that they were successful at it, and not just with one or two books. Even with Louisa May Alcott's Little Women was the major one, but then she kept writing and sold just as Catherine Sedgwick did. So that's a
Um,
really interesting question. I'm going to have to look into that.
Yeah.
And
Laurie, how many books did she write?
Catherine Sedgwick
Yeah.
wrote 6 books that are major books. She wrote other, smaller essays and tracts and things. But
Okay.
Redwood, A New England Tale, Married or Single, Hope Leslie, and those were the major, Married or Single. So that's 5, and then one tract that her brother had wanted her to start with nonfiction, and to start a book about the Calvinism and the limits of Calvinism, and why Unitarian Universalism promoted a different perspective, not a punitive God, a compassionate, loving God, all of that. And she did write it, and she did publish it, but she felt right then and there that she was not a nonfiction writer. That's when she knew she had to tell a story.
So what about Margaret Fuller? Because they would have been contemporaries. And of course, Margaret Fuller has probably a more prominent, name recognition, certainly in
Mhm.
Unitarian Universalist circles. Do you know if they knew each other?
That I don't, but that they moved in totally different circles, because Margaret Fuller was more the transcendental New England individual, and Catherine Mariah Sedgwick was based in the Berkshires or in New York City, and she was not she wasn't particularly a transcendentalist. She was, she was different. Margaret Fuller is very much of a theoretician and very philosophical. Catherine Mariah Sedgwick was no fool, but she was not an academic in that sense. She was, she was very thoughtful, and I mean, just talking about mixed race marriage is pretty forward thinking. And when she talks about her social justice work, she's very knowledgeable and dedicated, but she never had the patience to deal with long academic tracts or philosophical theories. That wasn't, she was very vivacious and active and going, and we're going to do this, we're going to do that. It's amazing. Even to visit a prison 3 days a week, even when she's in her 50s, is remarkable. She's very energetic and very, very outgoing. She would have not been good during COVID.
Other questions? I wonder if you could just expound a little bit about her her ability to, well, she lived in Stockbridge, and you said to me anyway that there's an archive there, there's a library, there are people who really see her as being a very important legacy for Stockbridge. Could you just expound on that a little bit?
Yes, and I'm so glad you mentioned that, Lillian, because that's the other really important thing I wanted to mention. And I would have totally forgotten, so thank you. There is a Catherine Mariah Sedgwick Society. She has a very active following. And this is why I'm just so amazed that I didn't know more about her, because there are people that are very interested in having her story told and doing research about her. And she is, the Stockbridge is very proud of her as their a noted daughter of Stockbridge. But much of her social justice work was in New York City. And that's how she became a particularly active member of All Souls, and I didn't mention that in my talk because it was getting long. Um, the, the founding of All Souls took place because Lucy Channing, William Ellery Channing's sister, asked William Ellery Channing to talk to this Unitarian congregation. And once he did and gave a very famous sermon there, many people gathered around him and wanted him to become the minister of All Souls, and he declined that, but he was very active in helping to found All Souls. And at that time, that's when the two brothers and Catharine joined All Souls because they actually knew William Ellery Channing. Channing performed last rites for Judge Sedgwick, and the Sedgwicks were, from this family that had been Congregationalists for decades, and so she was very involved in all of the reform movements she was involved with were all based in New York because that's what I mean. There are not tremendous numbers of prisons in Stockbridge, and
Yeah.
she was very interested in prison reform. She was also extraordinarily dedicated to providing for poor children, particularly Black children. And she started several schools that helped Black girls, particularly, have a skill, whether one was in needlework and I think one was in caregiving, so that they could help, support themselves and also help support their families. So, and then she was interested in hospital reform. So, all of those reform movements that she was so active with really were based in New York. And once her brothers moved there, she was in New York at least 6 months of the year, and sometimes more.
Yeah. Okay, Jean, go ahead.
I'm particularly fascinated. Oh, go no ahead. Doris, you go ahead because you haven't asked a question.
Yes, go ahead, Doris, but you have to unmute yourself.
And then Jean, I'll get to you after.
I'm muted.
All right. Very good,
I
Doris.
never thought I was muted myself.
No, neither did I.
Yeah, right.
That's
I
so
was wondering, yeah, I was wondering what her readers thought about that one novel of the intermarriage between an Indian and a Puritan. Did she have any kind of reaction, or did she just write these novels and someone said, "Oh well, that's her the way she thought about it"?
Well, I think it shows the variety of her interests. And Doris, I'm not sure. I mean, are you talking about, was there a reaction to the fact that she was discussing interracial marriage?
Right. Yeah.
There was not, and when you read the novel, you'll see why, because she doesn't proselytize. She tells the story, and then she lets the story tell itself. And why, I don't know if her audience was more enlightened, or if it was the way that she told the story. I mean, when you read that story, The Hope Leslie, you almost don't realize that, oh, my goodness, oh, yes, that's a white woman marrying an Indian. I see.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's part of the story. And you're so focused on the story, you don't even, that's what I love about her, because she never hits you over the head with her message. You know how some authors, oh my goodness, the moral. I mean, George Eliot is a perfect example. I know she's a wonderful writer, but that's not my, I like a more subtle approach. And that's exactly Catherine Mariah Sedgwick. She was that way, according to her letters, that's the kind of person she was too. Like even with her work in the prisons, she felt very, very, very strongly about what was happening to these prisoners, and she worked as hard as she could to make their life better. but she was not someone to go out and badger people,
Mm.
and insist that they do something immediately. She did her work, and that was it. And that was her contribution. And she organized. She wasn't sweet, simple, and girlish. She was a very good organizer. But she kind of inspired in her charity work. From her letters, she just inspired others to join her, and she made the work, no matter how troubling, she made the work joyful. And you can see from her attitude to the work when she's told to cut back by her family. And she says, but this is what brings joy to my life. And she's not doing it, to be worthy or to be noble or whatever. She's doing it because it enriches her life. And that's what she wanted to bring to it when she was head of the Prison Reform Society. That's what she wanted to bring to others who joined in her work. She's a
Um,
remarkable individual in who she is as a person.
Jean?
And when you read her stories, I think you'll discover that because it's so captured in the stories. They have such a light touch, even when she satirizes this woman, and the woman is just really annoying. But, she creates this portrait and then lets you take it from there.
Thank you, Laurie.
Nicole should go because she hasn't asked a question.
Oh, Nicole, go ahead. Unmute yourself.
Okay, I just wanted to find out if you knew what her position was towards suffrage.
She was supportive of the women getting the vote. She was certainly supportive of women earning a living and being single. What she wasn't supportive of was as I said before, a militant attitude toward anything. That was not her way. And it wasn't Louisa May Alcott's either. And it wasn't that they didn't support the ideal. Both of them were leery of people who went to what they saw as an extreme. And I think, but she was a feminist, kind of in the best sense of the word. It's just like with abolition. She had a lot of issues with some of the more fiery abolitionists, the ones that we think are, you know, just very admirable, and they were. But William Lloyd Garrison was almost lynched on the Common, and that firebrand kind of attitude. Garrison was so incendiary, and I'm a great admirer of his, that the South threatened to assassinate him if he had this on the Liberator on his newspaper. He had this a woodcut of a slave auction, and the South said, take that off, or we will make your life, we will endanger your life. And the next issue of the Liberator, he had the image 5 times the size. It took up almost the entire front page. And that kind of attitude. It's not that she condemned it, but that was not for her. She didn't feel comfortable with that. And when she was asked to come to an anti-slavery meeting, she particularly came because the people there were the Grimke sisters, and the Grimke sisters were Quakers. And again, they were not in the. They were also not comfortable with the more militant abolitionists as much against slavery as they were. So it was a temperamental. It wasn't a matter of her not agreeing in principle. She most certainly did. She had trouble with the tactics.
So what you're describing actually is that basically within the UU, two types
Hmm.
of activists. Some are strident and some are not.
Yes,
And that's,
exactly.
well, thank you for
Yeah.
bringing that up.
Okay, Jean, go ahead.
I find this really interesting that the fact that her father was the attorney for Elizabeth Freeman, for Mom Bet. And I mean, and here's her caretaker, Mom Bet, who is, gone off. I mean, I've been meaning to read about her, but the contrast of her not wanting to be out there, and yet here she has been raised by this woman in Massachusetts, who's the first woman, to go out to be, a free slave, and her father is the attorney. And I just find that whole connection really fascinating. That this is the African American woman who's essentially raised her, and is in a sense a firebrand, and her father must have been her attorney.
Yes. I mean, he also was. Um, he was very committed to his beliefs, but for instance, that little situation that when she's helped herself to his charge account, and he finds out, and his response, "Oh, my dear girl, this must not happen again." And that's all he has to say. And the fact that he has this frown is all she needs, because he too doesn't seem to be, from what I understand, he was a very fair-minded judge, and a very thoughtful and passionate, but not divisive. And it's the divisiveness that they, they don't feel comfortable with. And from what Nicole was saying, with the two strains of Unitarian Universalism, I see that so often. We, in another congregation I belong to in Pennsylvania, Unitarians are so so welcoming to everyone, et cetera, et cetera. But that was the good news. The bad news was that one fine day, a very successful and rather prominent international arms dealer decided that he would join our church, Mainline Unitarian. And he was also, he was an unusual person because he never really came into a service. He would periodically open the door and listen in for a few minutes and then close the door. So, for an hour, you had this back and forth with the door, which was interesting. And then he was, who he was. And we had a very active peace movement at our church. And one of my friends who was very passionate and not shy. And she said, "I just can't believe that we have an international arms dealer in our congregation. How can we do this? This is, I don't see it." She was completely distraught. And one of us, another person said, "Well, then, we really do not burn people at the stake." And Lynn said, "Well, it's not too late to start, is it?"
Well, I have to say that when we start talking about Unitarian Universalism as a general topic, we could go on for a very, very long time with stories. But I have to say that Laurie, you are an exceptional storyteller, and really do appreciate your coming, but also to introduce us to another very intriguing storyteller that many of us will go out now and read. And so it's been a special treat for you to do this and to celebrate Women's History Month as you have, by introducing us to Catharine Mariah Sedgwick. So please, let's all have a round of applause for Laurie, and we hope you can come back and do another program.
Laurie, I'd like to
Thank you.
say, I remember when you came to our church in full dress and you presented a person. Do you remember that?
Olympia Brown, right?
Yes.
Right.
And it was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'd like to thank you very much for the fact that obviously you couldn't reproduce the same theater type of stuff because of where we are now with COVID and everything. And yet you made it equally wonderful. So I'm really very grateful that you came.
Oh, that's so
Personal
kind.
thank you.
Thank you. Well, it was
Thank you.
lovely being with everyone, really. And you know, I look into the Catherine Mariah Sedgwick Society, and her. If anybody has any difficulty finding anything, her novels or her letters, there's a Catherine Mariah Sedgwick archive that is based in Stockbridge, but it's on the internet. And her letters are just glorious. There is no finer way of understanding someone than through her letters.
Yeah.
And what we're going to do without them. A friend of mine who writes biographies says, without letters, you have no biography. Because it's in
Right.
the letters that the personality of the person comes so clearly, how they write, the words they use, how they express themselves, you know, and that's how I really got to know Catherine Mariah Sedgwick. And I thought, I saw the letters first. I thought, this is just a wonderful person. I just want to, I hope she's done something significant because I'm writing about her.
Well, and we will look forward to the time when we can be all together at First Church, and you can come in sailing in as Olympia Browns, because we'll have to repeat that program.
I
She wore a
would-
great
Yes.
costume, so
Please.
that would be a great treat for us to look
Yes.
forward to. So thank you very much for being with us today, and go out. It is a little bit of sunshine out there, maybe, but we have a longer day